What if the reflection in your rearview mirror wasn't yours, but someone else's? A face pale as death, with hollow black eyes staring back at you, closer each time you blink. This is exactly what happened to Zeka on a stormy night when he took the wrong road. And what he saw that night, no living soul should ever have to see. The road stretched before him, an endless path of dirt and gravel swallowed by the darkness. His motorcycle's engine roared against the silence, its lone headlight cutting through the thick fog rolling in from the fields. His phone had no signal, no GPS. The last message he had sent was hours ago. He told himself it was just another late-night ride home until he saw her. A figure in white standing still on the roadside, her wedding dress tattered and swaying unnaturally in the windless air. Zeka slowed down, his fingers gripping the handlebars. The woman didn't move. The veil covered her face, but he could hear it, the faint, uneven sound of someone sobbing. His rational mind screamed at him to keep going, to ignore the eerie figure and get the hell out of there. But something, some primal, inexplicable pull, made him stop. His breath hitched as his headlight flickered. The temperature around him dropped, and his smartwatch vibrated violently against his wrist, flashing heart rate 140 BPM, warning, irregular pattern. "Miss, are you okay?" His voice came out hoarse, barely louder than the rain tapping against his helmet. The crying stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than the night itself. Then she moved just an inch, but it was enough. Her bouquet of dead flowers slipped from her hands, landing soundlessly on the wet ground. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Zeka's fingers trembled as he reached for his phone, the screen unresponsive, locked in an error loop. System malfunction, voice command unavailable. And then she lifted her head. What happened next? Zeka never fully remembered. Or maybe his mind refused to, because the last thing he recalled before the world turned to darkness was her face. Gray, lifeless, her mouth stretching far beyond what was humanly possible. And the sound, that horrible, scraping laughter, a noise that didn't belong in this world. Zeka's body went rigid. His breath hitched as his eyes locked onto the horrifying sight before him. The bride's face, now fully revealed in the dim glow of his flickering motorcycle headlight. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over sharp sunken cheekbones. Her eyes were black voids swallowing the night itself, but it was her mouth that sent ice through his veins. It was too wide, too unnatural, stretching inhumanly across her face as though it had been torn open to reveal jagged, mismatched teeth. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get on his motorcycle and speed away, but his body refused to move. A paralyzing fear wrapped around his chest like unseen hands gripping his ribs, squeezing the air from his lungs. His smartwatch vibrated again, this time flashing, oxygen levels dropping. Breathe. He gasped, forcing himself to take in air. The bride hadn't moved, but the space between them had shrunk. He was sure of it. He hadn't stepped forward, yet she was closer. His fingers fumbled for the ignition, but the motorcycle sputtered, its engine wheezing like a dying breath. The headlight dimmed. The darkness around him thickened, swallowing the trees, the road, everything except her. And then she laughed. Not a normal laugh, not something human, but a slow, distorted rasp that crawled under his skin and nested in his bones. It started softly, then grew, bending and warping into something deeper, guttural, vibrating through the air like it was coming from everywhere at once. A sudden snap echoed through the night. Zeka whipped his head around, expecting to see a broken branch, an animal in the bushes, anything rational. But there was nothing. Just darkness pressing in from all sides. And when he turned back, the bride was gone. The space where she had stood was empty, the dead bouquet still lying on the ground, its petals now scattered by an unfelt wind. A warning rang in his head. Don't look away. Never look away. His grandfather had told him stories when he was young, about spirits that lingered on empty roads, waiting for someone foolish enough to notice them. Once they knew you had seen them, they wouldn't let you go. Heart hammering. He grabbed his phone. The screen glowed bright, but the device was unresponsive. He pressed the home button. Nothing. The power button, still nothing. Then the screen flickered. The brightness dimmed. A grainy image began to form, static washing over it like a corrupted video feed. His own reflection appeared. At first, it was normal. His wide eyes, his helmet's visor partially raised. But then, something shifted. His reflection blinked. He hadn't. A cold sweat broke over his skin as his mirrored self slowly turned its head to look at something behind him. Zika spun around, his stomach lurching. A gust of icy wind rushed past him, carrying a sickly sweet scent of decayed flowers. The trees groaned, their branches swaying violently, yet there was no breeze. His ears rang with silence. Too much silence. No insects. No distant rustling. No sound at all except a whisper, a breath, chilling and damp right by his ear. "I never made it to the altar," Zeka screamed. Blind panic overtook him. He jumped onto the bike, frantically twisting the key. The engine stuttered, coughed, then roared to life. The headlight flared back on, slicing through the darkness, and for a split second, he saw her in the beam, right behind him. Her veil lifted, revealing the full horror of her face, her jaw, unhinging wider, stretching into an impossible scream. The motorcycle lurched forward. Zeka didn't think, didn't look back, just slammed the throttle open, his tires skidding against the dirt road as he tore through the night. His pulse pounded in his skull, his mind screaming, "Go, go, go!" He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to escape. The road twisted, and his tires barely gripped the wet ground as he pushed his speed to the limit. The digital speedometer flickered wildly, the numbers jumping erratically between 20, 65, 0, 99, before blinking out entirely. His GPS app opened on its own, the map glitching with random distorted coordinates flashing across the screen. The voice assistant suddenly activated, recalculating route. The robotic voice glitched, distorting. "You will not leave." A burst of static exploded through his helmet's Bluetooth speakers. Then, a weight. Zeka felt it instantly. His bike sank like something had just climbed onto the back. The rear suspension dipped, the added pressure throwing off his balance. His breath hitched. Something was on the bike with him. The air behind him turned freezing. He didn't dare look. In the mirrors, tears burned in his eyes as he accelerated. The world around him blurred, but he swore he could feel fingers, cold, skeletal fingers, pressing against his ribs, tightening, and then lights. A gas station appeared, ahead, its fluorescent glow flickering like a dying heartbeat. Salvation. Safety. He yanked the handlebars, swerving. Zeka stood frozen in the dim fluorescent glow of the gas station, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The article on the cashier's phone burned into his mind. Another missing motorcyclist, another empty road, another mystery that no one dared explain. But it wasn't the words that made his stomach lurch. It was the reflection in the glass door. She was there. The veiled figure loomed behind him, standing impossibly close. The sheer fabric draped over her face fluttered slightly, as if she were breathing. But that wasn't possible. She wasn't alive. His fingers curled into trembling fists. "You made it to the gas station. She can't reach you here." The thought was desperate, but false hope never saved anyone. Then the lights flickered. A deep, guttural static burst through the speakers of the store's security system. The cashier frowned, tapping her screen. "Weird. The camera's just shut off," she muttered, but Zeka barely heard her. His smartwatch vibrated violently against his wrist. He looked down. Proximity alert. Object detected behind you. His stomach twisted. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against his back. He could feel the shape of something standing there just beyond his vision, where shadows bled into reality. His reflection trembled as he turned his head ever so slightly. The veil was gone. A scream. His own scream caught in his throat as he locked eyes with the horror standing behind him. The bride's face had changed. Her mouth was stretched open in a silent wail, black veins creeping across her skin, her hollowed eyes filled with something ancient, something starving. And worse, she was grinning. The lights exploded, glass shattered. The store plunged into darkness, swallowed by an unnatural void. The buzzing of electricity died, replaced by a suffocating silence. A pressure, cold, suffocating, closed around Zeka's throat, as if unseen hands were gripping him, squeezing tighter, pulling him back. He thrashed, his boots slipping on the tile. He wasn't in the gas station anymore. The smell of dust, of old wooden pews and rotting flowers filled his lungs. His boots scraped against stone, not tile. Zeka's heart slammed against his ribs as the realization crashed down on him. No, this isn't real. But it was. He was no longer inside the store. He was inside a church, an abandoned, decayed chapel bathed in moonlight filtering through shattered stained glass. The pews were covered in cobwebs. The air was thick with the scent of mold, damp earth, and something else. Something dead. A whisper slid through the empty space. "You came, for me." Zeka's entire body jerked backward. He was no longer standing, he was kneeling. The floor beneath him was cold, the stones slick beneath his palms. His pulse roared in his ears as he tried to move, but his wrists wouldn't budge. He looked down. Ropes. His hands were bound. Panic flooded his veins. He tried to break free, but the bindings only tightened. No, this isn't happening. His breath came in ragged gulps as he scanned the chapel, until he saw it. The altar. A wedding altar. The long, tattered carpet stretched toward it, littered with wilting petals, leading to a grotesque sight. A decayed corpse, slumped over in a chair, a blackened wedding dress draped over brittle bones. A veil hung over the skeletal face, and in her bony grasp she still held a bouquet. The flowers were fresh. His stomach turned. A rustling sound slithered behind him. His skin crawled. He didn't need to turn around. He knew who was there. The bride. A cold hand brushed the back of his neck, fingers grazing his skin in a mockery of affection. A breath, cold, hollow, empty, sent a shiver racing down his spine. She leaned closer, her lips near his ear. "Say it." Terror clawed its way up his throat. "Say what?" he stammered, voice hoarse. "The vow." His stomach twisted. Zeka thrashed against the bindings, panic overwhelming him. This wasn't a haunting, this wasn't just some spirit lingering on a lonely road. This was a ceremony, a ritual. She wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for a groom. And he had been chosen. Zeka screamed. The chapel walls trembled, shadows stretching unnaturally as the unseen force pressed against him, forcing him deeper into his fate. The bride's icy grip lingered on his skin, her breath a hollow whisper against his ear. Say the vow." His mind reeled, his pulse hammering as he struggled against the ropes. No. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't real. Then, a noise, the distant roar of an engine. The world shattered. The suffocating darkness around him fractured like glass, and suddenly, he was back. Gasping, thrashing, falling backward onto the gas station's cold tile floor. The fluorescent lights hummed above him, flickering but real. The stale smell of convenience store coffee filled his nostrils. His hands were free. The bindings, the chapel, the skeletal bride, gone. The cashier stared at him, wide-eyed. "Dude, what the hell just happened?" Zeka sat up, his breath ragged, his body trembling. Did you see her?" His voice barely escaped his lips. The girl frowned, glancing at the security monitor behind her. The screen was filled with static. The footage skipped, 1 frame, 2 frames, then went dark. "I don't know, man," she muttered, chewing her gum slowly. "Cameras bugged out for a sec. Looked like you were just standing there." Zeka's stomach twisted. He grabbed his phone, hands shaking as he pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life. No missed calls, no errors, no distorted images staring back at him. Just the normal home screen. Normal. Everything was normal, except for one thing. The GPS app was open. A single route was still running. The destination, an abandoned chapel, 40 miles outside of town. Zika's blood ran cold. His breathing turned shallow. His fingers hovered over the screen, hesitant to touch it. But before he could react, the phone buzzed. A new notification. Incoming call, unknown number. His thumb trembled as he declined it. But as soon as the screen dimmed, the reflection of the glass door caught his eye, and there, just behind him, was the faint outline of a bride's veil. What if the man you stopped to help wasn't human? What if, in the dim glow of your headlights, you realized too late that his eyes reflected light like an animal's? And what if, as you drove away, your car got heavier, the air turned colder, and your breath fogged the windshield because something had joined you? I never believed in the stories my grandfather used to tell. Tales of things that waited at deserted crossroads, disguising themselves as lost souls. I thought they were just superstitions, warnings meant to keep us from straying too far into the unknown. But now I know the truth. Because the night I took the wrong turn, I met him. The road stretched endlessly before me, a winding dirt path swallowed by darkness. My dashboard flickered, the old radio tuning into nothing but static, and my GPS spun wildly, unable to pinpoint my location. I told myself it was just a glitch. But then, through the mist rolling over the road, I saw him. A lone figure sat on the roadside, his back hunched, his hat pulled low over his face. His clothes were tattered, his hands gnarled and unmoving. He didn't wave for help. He didn't even move, but I felt his gaze piercing through me, long before I hit the brakes. A cold weight settled in my chest. Something about him felt wrong, though I couldn't explain why. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, but I hesitated, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. In the countryside, you didn't leave an old man stranded. I rolled down the window. "Hey, sir, do you need a ride?" For a long, unbearable moment, he didn't answer. Then, his head lifted, just slightly. And in the glow of my high beams, I saw them. His eyes. They weren't human. I shouldn't have stopped. Ever since I was a kid, my grandfather warned me, never stop at a crossroads at night. He said there were things that waited there, not meant to be seen, but if you noticed them, they would notice you back. I never believed in those stories. I thought they were just old folk tales, meant to scare children. But now I was here, alone. The rain had turned the dirt road into a thick sludge, and my tires were slipping deeper into the mud. The engine coughed, struggling but wouldn't turn over. My headlights flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows through the mist. And that man, that old man, was still standing at the side of the road. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even blinking. Just standing there, watching me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the sweat slicking my palms. My phone sat beside me, still glitching, the GPS screen spinning aimlessly. The voice assistant suddenly came to life, even though I hadn't touched anything. Recalculating. The robotic voice dragged out the words, warping, as if struggling to form them correctly. Then, my phone screen went black. A moment later, a single phrase appeared. "Pick up the passenger." My breath hitched. I did not type that. My stomach churned as I stole a glance in the rearview mirror. The old man was closer. My heart slammed against my ribs. No, that wasn't possible. I hadn't looked away. I hadn't seen him move. I reached for the ignition again, twisting the key frantically. The engine roared, then died. The rain outside turned heavier, hammering against the windshield. A deep, pulsing static hummed through the speakers even though the radio was off. And then, the back door lock clicked open. My entire body went cold. I didn't turn. I couldn't. But I felt it. The air inside the car shifted. It grew denser, heavier. Like someone had just climbed inside, I could hear it. Breathing, slow, deep, rotten. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, trying to call someone, anyone. But the moment my fingers brushed the screen, the entire car jerked forward. The tires spun. The vehicle moved. I wasn't touching the gas. The road stretched ahead of me, but something felt wrong. The headlights weren't illuminating anything new. The scenery wasn't changing. It was as if I were driving in place, going nowhere. A deep, gravelly voice crawled through the speakers. "You saw me." I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't look. "You know what that means?" The smell of damp earth and something rotting filled the air. My fingers clenched the wheel, knuckles turning white. I forced myself to breathe, to think, but every instinct screamed that I was no longer alone. The rearview mirror shifted, on its own. It tilted downward, angling itself until it pointed straight at the back seat. I saw him, sitting there. His hat was off now, revealing a bald, scarred scalp, skin stitched together like an old leather sack. His bony fingers rested on his lap, but his mouth was still grinning, too wide, too stretched. The voice in the radio distorted, twisting between static and a sickening guttural tone. "You have to take me." My stomach turned. I slammed, my foot against the brake, the tires skidding violently on the wet road. The car screeched to a stop. I grabbed the handle and threw the door open, diving out into the mud. The cold rain hit me like needles, drenching my clothes, soaking my skin. I scrambled backward, my breath ragged, but the car was empty. The back seat was empty. My lungs burned. My head spun. Where was he? Then my phone buzzed. I looked down at the screen. My entire body locked up. Unread message. I hesitated, fingers trembling as I tapped it open. A single sentence. "You can't leave me behind." My breath turned shallow. My vision blurred as I slowly lifted my head and saw him, standing in front of me, not far away. Not on the road, right in front of my car's hood. I stumbled back, slipping in the mud. His hat was gone now, revealing the full horror of his head, stitched together flesh, darkened veins, deep sunken eye sockets filled with endless black. He took a step closer, then another. I scrambled back toward the car, pulling myself into the driver's seat. The door slammed shut on its own. The lock clicked, and then the radio turned on. The old man's voice whispered through the speakers. "You saw me." The engine revved on its own. The GPS recalculated, rerouting itself. The new destination appeared, glitching and flickering. Final stop, home. Except it wasn't my home. I looked up. The old man was in the back seat, and he was still smiling. The engine revved on its own. The gas pedal sank to the floor, though my foot wasn't even touching it. The car lurched forward, tires skidding in the mud, the headlights slicing through the misty darkness. I yanked at the wheel, but it didn't budge. My hands felt welded to the leather, an invisible force locking my fingers in place. The speedometer climbed rapidly, 50, 70, 90. The road ahead was twisting, narrowing, but I had no control. The old man was in the back seat. He hadn't spoken. Since the last time, his voice crackled through the radio, but I could feel his presence pressing against me, the weight of his body stretching the shadows in the rearview mirror. I didn't dare look. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The phone screen on the dashboard flickered violently, as if caught between two signals. A new message appeared. "Drive until the road ends." The road didn't end. The scenery repeated itself. The same old trees, the same worn-down signs, the same twisted turns. I was trapped in a loop, a road with no exit. The radio crackled. The old man laughed softly. "You picked me up. Now you take me where I want to go." My vision blurred as my fingers dug into the wheel. I had to think. Had to break whatever this was. The road. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. I was going in circles, being forced to drive in a reality that didn't follow any logic. I had to do the opposite. I closed my eyes, took a shaky breath, and before I could second-guess myself, I yanked the wheel hard to the left. The car spun out of control. Tires screamed. Mud sprayed against the windshield. I felt my stomach flip as the vehicle twisted violently, the weight of the old man shifting. He hadn't expected that. The laughter in the radio cut off abruptly as the car veered off the road, and then silence. The world stopped moving. For the first time in what felt like hours, my body was my own again. My hands loosened their grip on the wheel. My foot was free. I was back in control. A heavy breath rasped behind me. I slowly turned my head. The back seat was empty, but the door was open, and the old man's hat sat neatly on the passenger seat. The radio hissed softly, almost like static, but beneath the sound, beneath the faint hum of the speakers, I could still hear his voice. "The road isn't done with you yet." The night was impossibly still. The engine of my car had stalled, the headlights barely illuminating the misty road ahead. My body trembled as I forced myself to breathe. Was it over? My hands still shook from gripping the wheel, the sensation of losing control lingering like a phantom in my bones. I reached for my phone, hesitating before unlocking the screen. My GPS was normal again. No glitches, no strange routes, just a standard map showing my location. The old dirt road stretched behind me untouched. But as my fingers hovered over the screen, a single notification made my stomach lurch. One unread message. My pulse pounded as I tapped it open. "You took the wrong exit." A cold shiver ran down my spine. My eyes darted to the passenger seat. The old man's hat was gone. My heartbeat quickened. I frantically checked the back seat. Empty. I even stepped out of the car, scanning the trees, the road, the suffocating darkness beyond. Nothing. But as I turned back to my car, my blood froze. There were footprints, wet, muddy, deep footprints, leading away from my car, but none leading toward it. The wind howled through the crossroads, rustling the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of laughter echoed, carried on the night air. I climbed back into the car, locking the doors, my fingers clenched, so tightly around the wheel that my knuckles ached. I didn't look at the rearview mirror. I didn't check my phone again. I just drove. But as I reached the main road, the weight in my chest refused to lift. My headlights flickered one last time, and for just a moment, a split second, I swore I saw a figure standing at the next crossroads, waiting and smiling. What if the place you thought was abandoned wasn't empty at all? What if, as you stepped inside, something stepped closer too, unseen, watching, waiting? And what if, when you finally tried to leave, you realized it wouldn't let you? We had heard the stories. Every town has one, a place that no one goes to after dark. An old factory, a deserted asylum, a ruined mansion rotting under the weight of its own forgotten past. For us, it was the abandoned sugar mill. It had stood there for decades, swallowed by creeping vines and thick undergrowth, its rusted metal beams jutting from the ground like broken ribs. They said it was cursed, that workers had died there, that their spirits never left. We thought it was just a legend, a story meant to keep kids like us from exploring. So of course we had to go in. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of rotting wood and rust seeping into our lungs as we stepped over the shattered doorway. Inside, the silence was heavy. Too heavy. The kind that makes your ears ring, that makes your own breathing sound too loud. Our flashlights flickered as if struggling against the darkness, and for the first time, I felt it. We were not alone. But by the time we realized that, it was already too late. The moment we crossed the threshold of the abandoned sugar mill, a heavy silence settled around us. The kind that made you feel like the air itself was pressing against your skin, like the building was breathing. I was with Chico and Lucas, my best friends since childhood. We had explored plenty of abandoned places before, old train yards, deserted houses, even a collapsed church once. But this place felt different. The walls were damp, coated in layers of black mold. The rusted machinery loomed over us like skeletal remains, twisted and broken. Chico was the bravest or the most reckless. He walked ahead, swinging his flashlight across the shattered windows, the collapsed ceilings. "See? Nothing here," he said, kicking a pile of debris. His voice echoed, stretching too long like something else was repeating it deeper inside the ruins. Lucas muttered a curse under his breath. I don't like this place. Neither did I. But none of us wanted to be the first to say, "Let's leave." My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, but there was no signal. No internet, no GPS, nothing. Just a notification that shouldn't have been there. Welcome inside. A cold weight settled in my stomach. "Guys," I whispered, showing them the screen. Lucas paled. "Who sent that?" Before I could answer, a metallic clang echoed through the ruins, a sharp scraping noise like iron being dragged against concrete. It came from deep inside the factory. Chico grinned, shaking his head. "Just the wind." Except there was no wind. Lucas grabbed my arm. His hand was freezing. "Let's go now." But Chico was already moving forward. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to follow. The deeper we went, the darker it became. Even our flashlight struggled against the shadows, the beams flickering, growing weaker as if the darkness was feeding on the light. We reached what had once been the processing room, an open space where rusted chains still hung from the ceiling. The ground was covered in something thick and dark. At first, I thought it was oil. Then my flashlight caught the bones. Lucas cursed, stumbling back. "What the hell is this?" Chico knelt beside the remains, brushing away debris. The bones were old, too old, cracked and yellowed with time. Some were small, not animal small, human small. My throat tightened. "We shouldn't be here." Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, not ours. Lucas wheeled around, pointing his flashlight toward the doorway we had just come through. There was no one there, but the chains were swaying. Chico stood, suddenly uneasy. "Okay, maybe we should..." The sound of metal slamming shut made us all jump. The entrance. It was gone. The doorway we had just walked through was now nothing, but a solid wall. My heart pounded. "What the..." Chico ran forward, banging on the bricks, his breathing turning ragged. This was the way out." His voice cracked, filled with panic. The air shifted, grew colder. A whisper crawled along my spine, low, distant. "You shouldn't have come." Lucas turned to me, his flashlight trembling. "Did you hear that?" I barely managed a nod. Then, the lights died. The darkness swallowed everything. A vast, suffocating void so thick it felt alive. And in that darkness I felt it. Something moved. Something else was inside the ruins with us. And it was waiting. The darkness was alive. It wrapped around us, thick and suffocating, pressing against our skin. The cold sank deep into my bones, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. I reached out blindly, fingers trembling, and felt Lucas clutching my arm like a vice. Then, a breath, not ours. A slow, rasping exhale, just inches away. The chains rattled above us. The metallic sound scraped through the silence like nails against bone. And then, a footstep, right behind us. Chico's flashlight flickered back to life. But the beam wasn't pointing forward. It was pointing at us. Chico stood frozen, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. But he wasn't holding the flashlight anymore. It was floating. A hand, thin, blackened, too long, was holding it. The light shifted slightly, tilting upward, illuminating the thing standing in the center of the room, a figure, gaunt, wrong, dressed in tattered old clothes, its jaw hanging open unnaturally wide as if dislocated. The skin on its face was dry and stretched tight over hollow bones, but its eyes, God, its eyes, they were looking straight at us. Lucas made a strangled sound in his throat. Chico's breath hitched. And then, the thing moved. Not walking, not running. It just appeared, closer, then again, and again. A jerking blur of movement flickering toward us like a corrupted video. Lucas screamed. We ran. We didn't have a plan. There was no plan. The only thought was, move, move, move. I grabbed Lucas by the shirt and yanked him toward the rusted stairs at the edge of the room. Chico was already ahead, sprinting up the steps. The whole structure groaned under our weight, years of rot barely holding it together. But the footsteps, they followed. We reached the top floor, our boots skidding against the damp, decaying wood. Lucas tripped, catching himself against an old conveyor belt. Chico darted to the far end, searching desperately for another way out. Then he stopped. I turned my flashlight toward him, and the light trembled as my hand shook violently. There was a figure standing behind him. Not the thing from before Chico, another Chico. Identical in every way except wrong. Its mouth was stretched open too wide, its teeth dark and jagged, and its eyes, they were black pits. The real Chico hadn't noticed yet. He was still looking for a door, still panting, still human. Then the other Chico whispered, "This way." Chico froze. Lucas and I barely had time to react before the floor collapsed beneath us. We crashed down onto the level below, our backs slamming into rusted machinery. The impact knocked the air from my lungs, stars bursting in my vision. My flashlight skidded across the floor, the beam landing on the open doorway ahead. I grabbed Lucas, yanking him to his feet. "Go, go, go!" We didn't look back, we didn't stop. We ran, and behind us, from the ruins we should have never entered, something laughed. Something that sounded like all of our voices at once. We didn't stop running, not when we reached the doorway, not when we stumbled out into the thick, humid air of the night. Our lungs burned, our legs ached, but none of it mattered. We just needed to get away. The ruins loomed behind us, swallowed in darkness. The oppressive silence returned, wrapping around the building like a veil. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the factory had swallowed everything whole, leaving only its empty, crumbling shell. Chico collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. Lucas doubled over, hands on his knees, his whole body shaking. Did that really happen?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him it was just our imagination, the tricks of an old, decayed building. But then, my phone buzzed. I pulled it from my pocket, hesitating before unlocking the screen. There was only one notification, unread message. My breath caught. My fingers trembled as I tapped the screen. "See you soon." I looked up, my blood running cold. In the shattered window of the sugar mill, barely visible in the dim light, something was watching, and it was still smiling. Warning: once you start watching, they'll know you're here. Do you believe in urban legends? What if I told you that some of them are more than just stories? Tonight, we bring you 3 terrifying encounters: a ghostly bride waiting for a ride that never comes, an old man at the crossroads who isn't human, and a phantom lurking in the ruins watching, waiting. Will you dare to watch until the end? Or will you look away, just like they want you to? If you're brave enough, hit that like button to prove it. Subscribe for new horror stories every day, and make sure to ring the notification bell so you never miss a nightmarish tale. They're watching, are you?